Hi everybody. Today I'm sitting with Corey Haines, who kindly visited us in Israel. Hey Corey, how are you?
Hello, excellent. Thanks for having me here.
Why want you? Sure. Why want you introduce yourself? Just for the sake of people who didn't hear about you.
Posterity.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Corey Haines. I'm a developer, live in Chicago. I'm one of the co-founders of Code Retreat as a format, one of the main sort of evangelists of it and facilitators, and I do advising for non-technical startups with my girlfriend Sarah, and build my own projects and do training in companies, more kind of intermediate level OO training and test-driven development training types of things.
Cool things.
Yeah.
So what is a code retreat? We actually hosted 2 code retreats here in Israel, but could you maybe just summarize a little bit?
Sure. Code Retreat is a full-day event that's concentrated on practicing the fundamentals of software development, rather than spending the day trying to learn some new technology or even a new skill. It's really about taking the things that we should be doing and practicing to get better at it. And so the format of the day is we work on a set problem, which is Conway's Game of Life. That's every Code Retreat does. And we work in 45-minute sessions. And we pair up, do test-driven development, work on this problem. At the end of the 45 minutes, we delete all of the code. So you have to delete it, no putting it into source control or anything like that. And then we swap pairs. We have a little bit of a discussion. Depending on the facilitator, the discussion in between the sessions might be different. I tend to introduce constraints for the next session, and then we start again. And so usually about 5 or 6 sessions.
Yeah.
Through the course of the day.
So the constraints are slowly and gradually revealing some sort of object-oriented principles, or maybe some TDD principles, but they introduce you to think differently, or maybe to approach differently to a problem. So could you give an example of one constraint, and what does it mean, or how it reflects on object-oriented principle?
So one of my favorite constraints is being in the world of very small methods, no if statements, no language primitives, and one of mine I like is the no sort of language primitive data structures passed across method boundaries. And what these are really focused on is opening up your experience to using objects as your mechanism for polymorphism, which is sort of the no if statement constraint. Addressing some of the clean code principles with small methods, really looking to reify the concepts in your system via creating types for these main concepts rather than overloading the meaning of integer, say, or Boolean. And so there's constraints like this. You might have a session where there's a very heavy tell, don't ask principle, so you can't have a method return a value, and no properties, things like that. And while not all of the constraints are necessarily leading you towards better design, all of the constraints and all of the session exercises are there to expose something. So it might be showing you what doesn't work as well.
So let's talk about object-oriented a little bit. So we are like 40 years in object-oriented, right?
Oh, a million years.
But we also have some other paradigms, like aspect-oriented and functional. What is your opinion on those paradigms, and do they fit in the object-oriented world?
Well, I saw on Twitter, who was it? It wasn't Steve Klabnik, but somebody put on Twitter just yesterday that they're getting the feeling that our knowledge of OO is one big telephone game. which is that game where you get into a circle and you whisper into somebody's ear something, and then they whisper into the next person's ear, and then by the time it makes it all the way around the circle, it's totally different. It's just different than what it is. And so for me, like, I look at object-oriented concepts as really focusing on the message passing and the interactions between the objects rather than the class and inheritance and all of this stuff. Message passing lends itself towards encapsulation, lends itself towards polymorphism because it's really about messages. I think it's a wonderful paradigm. I think it's been overloaded and overdone, thinking that, as soon as it got to that point where, if you're working with a UI, or you're working with something that's you're interacting with, the idea of having your objects reflect real world things makes wonderful sense.
Yep.
When you move into the processing of your system, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think that that deep down in your deep underneath the covers, the idea of modeling the real world or modeling these entities makes sense. What you really are modeling are the processes that you're supposed to be doing, the transformations that you're working on. Ideally, that's where a functional paradigm is wonderful. It's been a long time since I did anything serious with a functional language. The last time that I really did a lot with, was with XSLT,
yep.
which is a horrible syntax around a wonderful functional language. And so, we did just fantastic things with it when you get past XML, let me turn it into HTML, and you actually use it as a processing language. So I think that it has its place. I don't think that it makes sense to look at replacing one with the other. Ideally, you use object principles when you're sort of at the surface layer, and then you use functional principles moving down through the processing of your system, and then sort of straight data principles when you're looking at storage and things like that. So that's the way I like to do it, and not like the functional languages that are very heavily functional. I don't spend a lot of time in them. I've paired with people in them, but I don't. My language of choice is Ruby. But I use a lot of the functional principles as I'm working through the process.
So definitely you're saying that you can see two of those paradigms living together and serving the same target, let's say. Mm-hmm. Not the same business target, but probably the same functional target or something.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you should be able to work with them together and put them in the place where they make the most sense.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned about pairing, and you actually had a year of pair programming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell about it a little bit?
I spent... So in the fall of 2008, I got fired from the startup I was at, and then went on about a 9-month trip where I was pairing for room and board. So I would go into a place, spend anywhere from a day to a week, and it was always pair programming, and work with them, and all they did was all I asked for was food and a place to sleep. And so I would stay with people, sleep on their floor. I had an air mattress, so I'd sleep on their floors, I'd sleep on guest beds, couches, things like that. And it was really this year of learning, because I got the opportunity to work with just fantastic people. Teaching, because I got the opportunity to then take a lot of that, pass it to the next person. And the idea that you would learn something one day and the next day be teaching it to somebody else really helps solidify that knowledge that you have. And it also gave me a good sense of a good, healthy understanding of where I'm at. Like, what level am I? Because it's easy when you're on a team where you surround yourself with people like you to go, I'm awesome. And going around and working with people over and over and over and over again and seeing, one guy I spent a week with and we spent 3 days just sort of playing around with TDD. He didn't really do a lot of it. And then the fourth day, we built an app. And he was astounded because he didn't think that you could be that fast with it. And so that was great. It was this opportunity to share with him. We then talked, and he talked a lot about his company and how, he and his wife had a consulting company. And so I learned a lot from there and then shared it with people.
So give me an example of what you really learned in terms of technique or maybe a different approach.
Mm-hmm. I really got a good sense for sort of the move between Cucumber, RSpec, Rails, and sort of, it was a good point, a good beginning foundation to build how I do it now. But working with several different people who used the tool sets, I got to see different people's strategies, see how they worked, and that really made it so I started to get a sense of what abstraction level I like to have. At Cucumber level, what should I be testing with RSpec?
So what are the examples? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, let's see. So I saw a lot of places where there was the writing Cucumber with fill in this field, fill in that field. And that just makes fragile, maintenance-heavy tests. And so seeing people and talking to people who were like, oh, no, you want to write it at this level and have the details be in your step definitions. One very simple thing is I spent several times, I went and visited David Chelemsky, who I've known for a while. I met him in 2004. And one of the really interesting things is that he had stopped putting should in his name. And I hadn't been doing it for a while, but one of the things he had said was that when your system is green, there's no should about the description. And we went down to the terminal, and he said, and he ran the command that showed the documentation format for RSpec. And it just lists out your context and describes everything in a nice nested fashion. And he said to me, he's like, everything we're doing, this is what it's for. It's to be able to read this. And that really was like an eye-opener to me, something as simple as that. But it was really that idea of, that then led me to spend more time crafting these strings. What do they say? How do they flow? And that then led me into some insights about how the process of writing those descriptions directly influences the code that gets written in the example. And that then directly influences the API you're using. Yep. So it's obvious to say, but all of that is about a thinking process, not just move to the next test, get it green. It's really about thinking. And that's something that, a simple thing I learned, or a simple thing someone said that laid a foundation for really big changes in some of the stuff that I teach.
Okay, and so those are primarily about coding.
Mm-hmm.
What about architecture, for example? Have you seen different styles, or have you learned something about that?
I've got the opportunity to start seeing some of the older Rails code bases, for example, because most of the stuff I do these days is in Rails, and so I'm seeing these older Rails code bases that you can look back at the early days, see the mistakes that were made in hindsight. Not always, you can't always see them, but one of the big things is that the days of the monolithic Rails app we've learned what happens, and it's not a pretty thing. It's really about what are the best ways, and I think a lot of us are learning that now, or studying that now, of what are the best ways to distribute out the services. And one of the interesting things is the idea of building a framework where the UI itself is completely separate from the back-end services project. And it's interesting because this is sort of the way that when I was doing C# I would build it, and for the most part we build it like that. Yeah. But Rails tends to have the actual project stuff so close together, even though the view layer is decoupled. But this is sort of decoupling it to the point where you're actually, not just from a development perspective they're separate, but you're sitting on top of HTTP as your message passing protocol, rather than the language itself.
Okay, so what about learning techniques? So what is your learning techniques? Obviously you code with others, so you learn from that experience, but what are other ways to learn?
Well, teaching. I think one of the best ways to learn is to teach and to share. So give talks. Don't give a talk so that it gives you a reason to learn something, but give a talk to share something that you think you know, and that'll cause you to really reflect back on it. One of the big ways I go about learning, when it's not like, oh, I want to learn backbone, but if I want to learn process, is I make sure that when I find a pain point, when I go, man, this didn't work, I take a couple minutes to reflect back on why it didn't work, rather than just going, because it sucks. But look and say, is there something I could do to have alleviated that? And then try to do that next time. So it's, reflection is a huge part of discovery and learning and all of that.
Okay. So thank you very much for your time,
and thanks for bringing me
sure
out here. You organized it all. I really appreciate it.
We will see you next year.
Yeah, it's a great place to come in the winter. Chicago's way too cold. Awesome. Thanks.